We are doing Extra Life again this year, where you can mash buttons, roll dice, play games, and help kids along the way. I hope you'll be a part of that with us. Stick around after the video for more information. Hey guys, Peter Franson here from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. This is part 2 of a 2-part video series sharing video journal entries that I recorded that chronicle my interview with games media personality Colin Moriarty, which I traveled out to California to do in person with him at the end of June 2019. If you missed part 1 of this video series, be sure to follow the first link below to see how I prepared for that event and what it was like to meet Colin Moriarty for the first time. That interview is alive to the public now. You can follow the second link below to listen to that entire interview before watching this video. I hope you do that. Assuming you've done that now, I'm going to share my video journal entries recorded soon after the interview, where I reacted to the experience as it was kind of still fresh in my mind. After those clips, I'll come back and share a few additional thoughts, including what we did not talk about that I had prepared to discuss with him, and also the likelihood for another chat with him in the future. Hope you enjoy. Well, I totally forgot to record, I think, anything while I was on my trip. I just was distracted by my mental preparations and the moments that I thought I might record something right before, going in. I thought I would be able to park my car near where the interview was going to take place and just record a little journal entry before going in, but I ended up having to park blocks away from where Colin's apartment was at. That combined with all the thoughts that I had on my mind to prepare, and the time I spent talking to Holly on the phone and praying beforehand, just put the idea of recording something like this totally off the radar. But as I imagine I've posted to patrons by now, it was an amazing interview. It went so well. I thought, my attitude and feelings about it leading into it had, my worry had subsided pretty, almost completely. I mean, I was nervy leading up to it, but not worried, if that makes sense. Kind of like the nerviness that one would feel before going out and performing in a play that they feel very prepared for, but they're still nervy because there's just the unknown, who knows what's going to happen, and it's a very in-the-moment kind of experience. But I wasn't worried, and I'm just really grateful that God enabled me to be in that space. I think a lot of it had to do with my preparation. God certainly uses preparation, but I think it also was in large part due to the perspective. He had me in. It was great. Colin was very welcoming to me and very just had a warmth to him that that almost surprised me a little bit. But not just hearing his podcast interviews. He hasn't done video of himself in a while, that kind of content, and so I was able to see the warmth in his expression and his easy smile, and it really made the interview very comfortable. I mean, before I knew it, I felt like I was talking to someone I'd been friends with for a little while. So it was great. Both of us said some things that surprised the other in positive ways. It was wonderful. It was great. One thing that came out of the interview that I've wondered for a while if it might be the case is some of the things that Colin and I have in common. I suspect that we have some personality traits in common. We're both introverted. We're both deliberate, contemplative thinkers. And we both have passion in us as well. And so it was interesting for me to share my story of when my questioning began and getting answers to those questions, and hearing about the same time of life in his life when his questioning began, but he was getting no answers. And then to see how our paths diverted from there. So it was just wonderful to share that time, to share our experiences, to put things out on the table, to share doubt and uncertainty and what Scripture says about that, and putting it on the table is something that, it's like God is not expecting us to have certainty and to be completely without doubt. He's just calling us into trust more and more, calling us into faith. But he knows we're going to struggle with that. I was surprised and delighted that I was able to share some things with him that he'd never heard before. I had assumed that, like, once the stop button got pushed in his conversations with the other Christians he had on, that they would have given him I gave him 3 books that I thought for sure he had already. I gave him the Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, The Case for Faith, same author, and Ravi Zacharias' book Can Man Live Without God, which was really instrumental in my the thought, the intellectual part of my faith and developing. And he'd never heard of either of those authors. He was not familiar with William Lane Craig, which William Lane Craig came up, and reasonablefaith.org comically came up multiple times in the interview. So I was really happy, feeling like I was able to bring some things to him that he was not aware of, that will hopefully be useful to him as he's exploring, the aspects of Christianity that do provoke questions. That I think beg for good answers. And so I've just been praying that he'll be able to find those answers, and he'll be interested in engaging with that search going forward. I think Colin and I would probably both say that it was a great experience. I was very gratified. He doesn't say this, he says it to a number of his guests, but not all of his guests. At the end of some of his interviews, he'll say, "Well, you're welcome back anytime." And I was wondering, I wonder if he'll say that to me, or if it's, gonna go not quite good enough for me to get that, comment from him. But he did say that once, and at least once, maybe twice, at the end of our conversation. And so I hope to take him up on that and have another conversation with him sometime in the future, because it was a wonderful, wonderful experience. It was really just a great experience, and I told him as much, that the way he was warm and welcoming, and just the way he handled the whole experience spoke to his skill and his gifting and his character all at once, I thought. So that was really cool. And then when we were done, we wrapped up, and I offered to treat him to dinner and or dessert, and I said, I assume you're probably swamped, but can I treat you to, dinner or dessert? And no, of course, he's a super busy guy, as I already knew about him, so he had other things that he needed to take care of. But I did have a chance to give him 3 books, and it's funny, he's had like 3 Christians on before, and I thought, well, gosh, he's probably had all 3 of these Christians try to give him the books that that I would like to offer to him to take and keep. But lo and behold, he had never... I wasn't surprised he hadn't heard of Ravi Zacharias. I gave him a copy of Can Man Live Without God, because that was very formative to me in my kind of like intellectual development of my faith. But he had never heard of Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ and The Case for Faith. It was so cool to be able to give him these 3 books, and he was just very appreciative and unassuming, and asked me for my address so that he could send them back to me. So I was like, "No, dude, these are yours," And so, but that was very sweet and thoughtful of him. After that, I think we just started heading out. He offered to walk me down. He had to get his mail anyway, and so we went down. And when we were going out the door, I was like, we never got to talk about any video games. Can I ask you some things about video games? Which I knew I wasn't going to try and force that. I wasn't hoping for that to happen in the interview, of course, but I had in my head, I was like, there's at least 1 or 2, like, just little quick nuggets it'd be fun to get from him. One was his impressions of his kind of like impressions of Bloodstained Ritual of the Night before his formal review goes out. Unbeknownst to me, though, until I listened to the episode of Sacred Symbols on the way home, he had already kind of shared on on that podcast earlier in the week, the thoughts that he shared with me. But I did get a chance to ask him if he had a prediction on whether or not Konami would release a collection of the Symphony-like Castlevania games. The ones that are like Symphony of the Night that were on the Game Boy Advance and the Nintendo DS, And for what it's worth, he said that he thought that they would, and he seemed pretty confident in that. And he didn't predict a timetable or anything, but that was really cool for me because I know he's a big, fan of that style of Castlevania games, and I'm a big fan of those types of games as well. And so to hear his perspective as an experienced industry person and game people predicting-y thingies person, that was cool because I would love to get that kind of collection. And then we got down to the ground floor, and at the last second, I remembered to ask him if I could get a photo with him. I am so glad I remembered, just because, not because like I'm a super big, like Colin Moriarty fanboy. I really have appreciated him, but I have developed more of an affection for him than like a fan type, what I would normally associate with like the feelings of being someone's fan, But I remember to get my phone out and take a picture, which I'm really glad I did because now that I'm home, the whole trip happened so fast, and I've been thinking about this interview and more purposefully preparing for it for the last week and a half, but it's been on my mind, and I've been lightly preparing for it on and off for almost 2 months, And so even though it is likely, he said, to be the longest episode of Fireside Chats ever up to this point, it still went by. So we probably talked for close to 2.5 hours. Oh my gosh, we were talking because we started early. We started at probably about 5:45 and finished, so maybe not 2.5 hours, 6:45, 7:45, at least 2 hours. 2 hours and maybe like 2 hours and 5 minutes or something like that. That would, if there's no editing involved, I'm guessing that will be the runtime. So I'm so glad I got that picture because, after it being done so fast and then sleeping the night over at my friend's house and then coming home, even that alone made the trip so fast. Driving out to LA one day and then driving back the very next day, I've never done that before. And so, having one night of sleep and then coming home and being in my house suddenly so much, feel like I never left. And then I took a little nap and woke up, and all the memories already had just started fading. I'm like, man, it feels like a dream. And the fact that it's over and I've been thinking about it so much, really wanting to do my due diligence and be able to bring substance to the conversation. I really tried to prepare, and be organized in my thoughts since I can be so scattered and my memory sucks so much. So I really did try to prepare in order to serve the content well and to serve Colin well and his listeners however I could. Yeah, so after all that, for it to be done so quickly, it feels like a dream, And so when that feeling kind of like popped into my head, I was like, let me look at this photo. Yeah, that really, that really did happen. That was weird. And when I pulled out my phone to take a picture, he said something like, are you rocking the iPhone 4S? Because it's an older phone, I just turned to him and smiled and said, we are simple folk. And he got a good chuckle out of that. So, and then that was about it. And he asked me to give his best to the rest of my family, which I did. And it was just a wonderful time. And I so appreciate him expressing an openness to having me back again anytime. And I certainly that's a great honor to hear that from him. So at some point down the line, I'll wait a good while until I feel like we have something substantially new or expanded to talk about. But I imagine I'll be in touch with him again, and we'll see what might come of that. Now, unfortunately, nothing is likely to come of a potential second appearance on Fireside Chats with Colin. A couple weeks before my interview went up, Colin announced that the Fireside Chats series is coming to an end. The reason for that being that Colin has had increasing antagonism and even threats expressed toward him, and so to protect himself and those close to him, he has discontinued his plans involving interaction with the public, including both fireside chats in which he really was inviting strangers to come into his home and talk with him, and also his plans to appear at various conventions in the future. I completely respect and support his decision to do this, and I honestly admire his bravery in doing far more public interaction up to this point than I would have done in his shoes. And while I am sad that that's the way that things have to be, it also makes the time that I spent with him all the more special and treasured by me. I do have a few notes to add about that interview. I'm not going to supplement any of the points that I made. I'd rather that content just stand on its own, but I want to correct a couple mistakes I made or areas that I fell short in. First, I really regret using the weird, silly voice that I did when I was making fun of my vocal performance degree. I almost immediately regretted it, and I realized, oh, someone could easily interpret that as me making fun of people who have a lisp. And that was not at all my intention or thought in my head. It was just the first kind of like cartoony, voice that popped into my head. So I am really sorry for my recklessness in that. If you or anyone else was hurt by that, it was not my intention at all. I was just looking to make fun of myself and my vocal performance degree. The other thing that I forgot or didn't think of was the last name, Jim Morrill. Jim Morrill was the man that was involved in was a volunteer in the high school ministry that was really helpful to me. And then my study mentor, Dave Lindstrom, I said he's fluent in Greek and Hebrew. That's actually the wrong word. I should have said proficient. He's proficient in Greek and Hebrew. He wouldn't describe himself as fluent. And then also, if you're wondering what I was talking about when I said God guys, there was a moment in the interview where Colin was really kind of like going on a tear for a little while, just firing off one thing after another, and I realized, okay, he is not going to come up for air, so I need to jot down some of these things. There's no way I'm going to be able to respond to all of these things. By that point in the interview, we'd already gone so long, we were well over the time frame that Colin typically likes to have those things in, and so I just was like frantically really quick, I mean, not visibly frantically, I don't think, but just listening, and I grabbed my one of my packets and found the blank side on the back of one of them, and just as I was listening, started like jotting down a few key points that I wanted to remember. One of them was God of the Gaps, which was an idea that he alluded to. He wasn't familiar with that phrase as came up in the conversation, but anyway, it ended up looking like God guys as I scribbled it down, so I just thought I would show that to you guys. Now, as far as the topics we did not discuss, there's just a couple things in my personal timeline. Let's see here. I didn't talk about as much. Oh, I didn't mention the Bart Ehrman debate being a great starting point if you're going to reasonablefaith.org. That's like a great starting point that I didn't mention. I also didn't talk about the Case for Christ or the Case for Faith books. That was my first exposure to William Lane Craig. And I think those books definitely are useful. In fact, I left one or more of them with Colin to keep, but I don't think that they're a great resource for really diving deep into the topics. They're more on the layperson level, but I didn't really bring up that. And then as far as like topics, in my big old 22-page alphabetized topic packet that I had, I didn't bring up the supportive verses or even mention that the Bible itself places value on reason and investigation. We didn't talk about the genetic fallacy, which I think is something that could have come up and might have been a useful thing to cover. There could have been so much said about heaven. We talked very little about heaven, and I had quite a bit prepared to talk about heaven, but we did not get there. We didn't talk about homosexuality. I thought that might come up. He surprised me a little bit by bringing up, what was it? The way he perceives the Bible treating women poorly, and I didn't prepare to talk about that. That really hasn't been a relevant issue because what I've seen about when people talk about that, there's just a really easy to correct misunderstanding about, the passage or the culture or the language or whatever. So I didn't prepare really any thoughts on that. I thought he might bring up something related to homosexuality. I was prepared to talk about that. We didn't get to that. I didn't talk about Hugh Ross, which is another apologetics resource at reasons.org. I've got mixed feelings about Hugh Ross. One or two of his books have been helpful to me, but I don't agree with kind of all of his philosophy. We didn't talk about inerrancy. The word came up, and that was about all we had time for. I think I just mentioned the fact that when we talk about inerrancy, we have to talk about what we mean by inerrancy. So there's a whole discussion we could have had on that, as well as the related topic of the inspiration of the Bible. What do we mean when we say the Bible is inspired? It's divinely inspired. There are different views on that, and so I didn't share the different views or my view on the inspiration of the Bible. We didn't talk really in depth about, we didn't talk about the claims of Jesus, that Jesus made some very, we both agreed that Jesus made some radical claims about himself, but we didn't have time for me to go through what those claims were and how significant the backdrop of those claims is when we look at the evidence that might suggest that Jesus rose from the dead. So that would have been interesting to get into. Yeah, just in general, I didn't get into anything about Lee Strobel and his background. We didn't get into the New Testament manuscript copies and the discrepancies found in those copies. We didn't get into that at all. That's definitely a relevant topic for stuff like this. Let's see here. I had like a number of questions that I was looking forward to asking Colin should the opportunity have presented itself. And those questions included, one of them we got to, but the ones we didn't get to is, can you describe the belief content of the kind of faith, quote unquote, that you hope to come to? As Colin has said in the past, I hope to come to faith. I would like to come to faith. And I was really curious about the belief content in his mind when he says faith that he would like to come to. Are you doing anything to pursue that hope or that desire to come to faith and see it potentially become realized? I would have been really curious to hear more about what, if anything, he's doing in his private time to explore those things. If heaven exists, would you want to go there, and why? I think the default reaction a lot of people might say is, well, if heaven exists, of course I'd want to go there. Well, would you? Why? What is it you believe about heaven that makes you want to go there? What is it you believe maybe about God? Have you thought about the fact that God is going to be there? Would you like to be with God, quote unquote, forever? Why or why not? Have you ever reflected on the potential role of your emotions in your rejection of God's existence? And so those would have been some really, as I said in the comments, of his on his Patreon page below the interview, I would have loved to have interviewed Colin, but that wasn't the purpose of the show. But anyway, so those are things I would have loved to have covered that we didn't. We didn't really talk about, fully at least, about the reasons that I still believe, despite all the doubts that I've felt at the various times of my life, the doubts that I still run into from time to time. What are the reasons when I feel those feelings of doubt? What are the reasons that I still believe? So we didn't cover that. We didn't cover salvation as a word. That comes up very often in my In Search of Truth series, which is my Bible study series at Christian Geek Central. That's really the nature of that word is really important to understand. And so we didn't get to that. We didn't get to the question of the unevangelized. It was mentioned briefly, but what happens to those who die without having ever heard of Jesus? What is their fate? And we didn't really talk about that in specific detail. There was a whole kind of bit that I had prepared about that. And then finally, we didn't talk about the witness of the Spirit. And that's the idea that Scripture expresses, that the Holy Spirit confirms to us as believers that we are the children of God, and that can really be a thing that helps believers persevere through doubts and stuff. And so there's lots of questions about, is that irrational? Is that reliable? What exactly is the witness of the Holy Spirit? And that's a really interesting topic, but we didn't get to that. So anyway, there's just so much more that our questioning minds could have together put on the table for examination. If you're interested, as I briefly alluded to, I do a line-by-line examination of the Bible each week on the Christian Geek Central podcast and YouTube channel in our In Search of Truth series. Now, it's geared toward those who are already Christians, so if you're not a Christian, it's not going to be geared toward you and maybe the questions that you would have, but my tendencies toward questioning certainly do fuel my preparation for that series. So if you enjoyed my chat with Colin, you might enjoy that series as well, or the rest of the wide array of content here on this channel. I've had a number of non-Christians regularly tell me that they enjoy and keep tabs on my content. So if you're not a Christian, you are certainly still welcome here, even though the content isn't specifically geared toward where you're at. So I hope that you'll stick around and check out Christian Geek Central. In closing, I really enjoyed my time with Colin, both because I've had developed really an affection for him over the years, and then secondarily kind of as a fan, a little, a geeky fan type thing. It was just a really neat experience on both counts. There are definitely things I wish I would have done better or covered more fully. Most of that was related to time constraints. We already ran long, but some of that was my own limits too. I tried to prepare as best I could, but my primary aim was to share my story and then along with that, provide Colin and his listeners some resources they could use to further their investigation into the Christian faith. And I think that in that way, my part of it was a success. And the response from Colin's audience has been, man, so far very, very positive. So I really couldn't feel much happier about the whole thing. I'd love to get your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. I also hope that you'll tell the video game fans in your life about this interview and share the links to it. Not only is it a cool glimpse into the mind of a major voice in games media and games coverage, it's also a great starting point, I think, for anyone who is asking the same questions Colin and I are asking and is looking for resources to investigate those questions further. I want to once again say thank you to Colin Moriarty. Thank you so much, Colin, for the opportunity to have this conversation with you. And also I want to thank all of Colin's patrons and fans who were very appreciative and respectful and kind in their interactions with me on Colin's Patreon page. I am going to be over there responding to comments for a week or so more from the date that this video goes up. If you'd like to react to the interview over there, or you can leave a comment here anytime. Even if this is an old video by the time you see this, I will very likely be notified and able to get back to you. All right, that's it. Thanks for joining me as I shared this, what was for me a really cool experience with you guys, and I hope that you'll stick around and here at Christian Geek Central and enjoy what you find as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. Thanks. Bye-bye. It is time for Extra Life again, and I'd love for you to be a part of it with me. Here's a recycled but slightly modified promo to tell you more. Once again this year, Christian Geek Central is participating in Extra Life. This is a charity that raises funds for the Children's Miracle Network of hospitals, which provides free medical care to children whose families could otherwise not afford it. And this is very often for critical, life-saving treatment. Joining our team only requires a willingness to ask your family and friends to consider donating toward your fundraising efforts. Participants also usually do something fun and game-related to draw attention to their fundraising efforts, like a special game night at your home or your church, or like me, you could do a crazy 24-hour video gaming marathon. Now, I'm theming it around video games, but really this event can be themed around any kind of gaming, which includes both video games and tabletop games of any kind. What you do to raise funds is entirely up to you, but I would love for you to consider joining the Christian Geek Central Extra Life team. As team leader, I'll be there to help answer your questions, provide some helpful tips if I can, and just in general be your fundraising cheerleader and try to draw attention myself to your fundraising efforts. You can get more information about the event as a whole at extra-life.org, and if you choose to sign up there, be sure to select Christian Geek Central as your team so I can get in touch with you and then just help in whatever way I can. Fundraising can begin at any time, but our main push is going to be through the month of October leading up to November 2nd. That's the annual Extra Life Game Day, when I'll be streaming my 24-hour video gaming marathon live and trying to stay awake without throwing up. More details on my live stream as we get closer to it. That's it for now. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.